Ladies and gentlemen, one of our speakers, who was meant to be a part of the panel who we'd been waiting for, has not arrived. So we'll be proceeding the panel discussion with our team this afternoon. This will be focusing on diversification, energy diversifications, drawing from lessons across the continent. Once again, leaning into the theme of Africa Energy Week this year, which is focused on enabling growth through an enabling environment. And this panel, like I said, will be led by and moderated by Sylvia Marcy. Elizabeth, Tabang, Amina, and Amina is not here with us, unfortunately. Wisnu will be a part of this panel. Let's welcome them warmly onto the podium as they engage us robustly. Thanks.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today on this discussion on energy diversification lessons for Africa. I'm thrilled to be joined by this great lineup of speakers. They've been introduced already, but let me do it once again for the sake of the audience with us. To my left, Elizabeth Ipangelwa, Legal and Energy Advisor at GIZ. Mr. Wisno Santoso, Senior Vice President of Business Development at Pertamina. And last but not least, Mr. Tabang Audat, Chief Director of Planning at the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy in South Africa. The discussion, as has been said at the beginning, will be looking at how to help the energy diversification in the African continent, or rather in the countries in Africa, because you know we are in front of very different realities. And how the policy framework, how the regulatory landscape can help attract investment and make sure that the right measures are taken towards energy diversification. Before we start, I would like to ask Mr. Santoso if we can define what sustainable energy is from an oil and gas, diversified oil and gas company's perspective. Sometimes we use the sustainable energy and we don't know what we're talking about. So can you clarify maybe from your point of view?
Thank you. First and foremost, thank you for having me. Delighted to be on this panel. I think you're correct. It's quite a paradox to hear sustainable words coming out from an oil and gas company. But actually, it is not. Because in my case in Indonesia, whereby the Indonesian government has committed to the Paris Agreement to become a net zero by 2060, and that us being the biggest oil and gas company in the country, we also have the same commitment. So we have a commitment to become a net zero by 2060. So therefore, our biggest task would be twofold. Number one is, of course, to reduce the emissions from our existing operations, which is to reduce Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, as well as to grow the new low-carbon businesses, which will lower, in the end, will lower our Scope 3 emissions as well. So that defines the sustainability. Sustainability does not mean that we don't emit, but we do it in more responsible way. We try also to develop carbon capture technology as well as carbon offsetting, so that net by 2060 or by designated time, we have a net zero in our brand. So I think pretty much that sums up. But however, I think this may not be very different with Africa as well. In Indonesia also, we are facing with the what we call an energy trilemma, which by we have to balance between energy security with energy affordability as well as energy sustainability. So we cannot go extreme in one direction and forsaking the other two aspects of the energy trilemma. So we have to maintain the balance of it.
Thank you. And Elizabeth, you're bringing to the panel the experience of Namibia. There's many things have happened in the past couple of years. So from a green industrialization perspective, what does it mean, sustainable energy?
Yeah, I just wanted to agree with you that sustainable energies is normally used, it has different meanings, but from a green industrialization perspective, we are really referring to sustainable economic growth. And by this, we mean using green hydrogen to decarbonize specific sectors like your mining sector, your green steel sector. So that's how we see it. We are going 100% renewable, a bit opposite to what he said, but that's how we understand it to be.
Absolutely. The starting point sometimes counts a lot, so that's why we also have different definitions. So let's get to the core of this discussion, which is about policy. And Mr. Dabang, can you talk about what South Africa has done in terms of giving clarity around energy policies to investors? So what are the highlights from the South African experience?
Thanks, Sylvia, for the initial introductions. Good afternoon, everyone. So perhaps before I get into the South Africa specific discussion, just to, from our perspective, outline the approach that we think is sustainable for African continent, right? So there are three considerations in policy development, energy policy development, in our view. The first is energy security, and we believe energy security is the most important, is sacrosanct, right? So it's important to maintain your sovereignty as any government, to have your energy independence and energy security. The second is energy access and affordability. And this is a critical point, especially in most indigenous African communities, right? So whilst the world is transitioning from high carbon emitting to low carbon emitting, most African countries are still grappling with energy access and energy affordability. So that's the second most important pillar. The third and the last one is environmental sustainability, right? So as we do all of this, we need to make sure that whenever we introduce new energy infrastructure, that all of that is done in an environmentally sustainable manner. So these are the three pillars in our view that when one develops a sound energy policy document, you need to consider all three. So coming to the question on South Africa, so our approach in South Africa is a little bit nuanced in that we don't write policies purely based on desktop research, right? So we build models. There's a gas model that we built. So we build the entire network, the entire value chain from production to consumption. We do the same with electricity, right? From coal mining or uranium mining all the way to electricity production, including transportation. So these are built on models, technical models, simulations, and from that we write what we call policy recommendations, which are then considered by cabinet, and once it's approved, obviously becomes a policy document. So the entire process, we prefer to call it evidence-based policy development. What that does, because we set a trajectory of project pipeline for 20 years or more, that tends to give investor confidence, because the investors will know that technology X is supported by government policy for the next 15, 20 years. So you tend to attract medium, long-term investments because investors will understand that they need to develop their full value chain and their 15 years, 20-year lifespan in the country. So that has been our approach in South Africa in terms of policy development. Firstly, to base it on data, hard data, on evidence, and advise policy makers to approve certain policy recommendations. Yeah.
Mr. Santoso, I'll move to you. You have an experience a lot of experience in Indonesia as your core market, but you also have international experience. You were saying you're active in different places. So what, in the markets you've been active in, what kind of policy have supported the investment of your company or in general towards the sustainable energy investment? What has been done, what has been successful, what still has to be done to further facilitate given the pace at which we need to improve sustainable investment?
Yeah, so thank you so much. So I think we are present in 4 continents, but mostly are driven by upstream oil and gas businesses. So I think to us, it's also an ongoing progress. We're also still learning because investing in oil and gas assets can be very different with investing in infrastructure assets in other part of the world. Like for example, if you want to invest, say, in a power investment in a certain country, of course, the country risk will be very much different with the impact on country will be very much different with, say, you invest in oil and gas sector in that particular country. So I think the political, the local regulations, the law that protects international investment would be very key and crucial, first and foremost. And then the stability of the political situation in that particular country will also be very determining of the type of investment that we can go or not go into that specific area.
Yeah.
And Elizabeth, on Namibia, I was going to say Nigeria. Well, what about the Namibia? What has been done in Namibia to clarify the political framework in which energy investment is made, and particularly for green hydrogen activity that you've overseen?
Yeah, speaking from a green hydrogen perspective, I mean, the industry has been moving faster than what we have on policy and paper. Today, you write on green ammonia. Tomorrow, there's green steel. There's something new. Everything is becoming green. So that has been a bit slowing us down because we are still assessing and benchmarking what would really work for Namibia, because over time Namibia has been benchmarking with SADC and seeing what's happening in South Africa and all our neighboring country, but also seeing at the international market. But that has been a bit very slow, so that has also slowed down our legislation or our policy making. But there have been, of course, certain instruments that we have implemented in our system just to get us going. So firstly, I'll be speaking from a framework perspective, and then I'll indeed move into a policy perspective. But in terms of like a framework perspective, Namibia has come up with, if you know already, the 5-year green hydrogen strategy, which was released in November 2022. And then we established a green hydrogen office that would then support project developers that are currently setting up in the country. So then we have some coordinated efforts also with the Namibian Investment Promotion Development Board, which is currently supporting investors to set up shop in Namibia. But in terms of policy, what we have really been focusing on, and considering that the type of industry that we want to move in is very cost extensive, so we need to come up with policies that would allow or create that enabling environment to allow for bankable projects in Namibia. So what we have done, or what we have been really looking at, is really the SEZ. So we have been looking at special economic zones policies in Namibia so that it can support green industrialization. So then, so government, so when I speak about special economic zones, I'm really talking about identifying areas where we can really stimulate industrialization in the country. So we have seen what Morocco has done. We think that that could also work in Namibia. But also another policy that we want to look at is really this EU CBAM. We want to look at the carbon border adjustment mechanism, if I got it correctly. So this is basically an EU trading system. So we want to look at, like people that, sectors or products that are used, that are being produced through green industrialization. How can we further incentivize those programs, to, products, to make sure that they, that they become bankable for those projects? So basically, those are some of the policies that we're really looking at as a country.
Yeah, it's not short-sighted. It's actually understanding that the market outside of Africa is changing. So if you want to keep the relationship with the rest of the world, you need to understand what's going on elsewhere. So we've talked about the energy trilemma. You all agree that it's the three priorities are there. And difficult sometimes to balance, really, to understand what comes first. But I think in Africa, we are in a continent where there's plenty of resources, from oil and gas to renewable energy. And Mr. Santoso, how can Africa optimize, or a market in general, if we don't want to talk about African countries, optimize all these resources to make sure that the energy trilemma, including sustainability, is achieved without, and making sure that there is energy security and energy availability for the people?
Yeah, yeah. So I think the experiences from Indonesia is that we need to optimize local resources. So I think the solution would be local. You cannot have one fit for all kind of solutions in big continents like Africa.
Absolutely.
So enabling a local community to be able to find out their own solution, I think is the key. And then does that require ways to foster collaborations, be it with the private sector, with the government, of course with the government backing as well, as inter-country as well, because I can imagine in countries in Africa where you have landlocked, surrounded by other countries, you need to have cooperation, right? So I think that would be very key. That would be very key. So the local solution for each region could be very different. So maximizing the potential resources that you have there, rather than transporting it or rather than building a grid transmission, which can be very costly. I think those kind of solution might also work, because that works in Indonesia as well, where you have many islands. You have isolated islands in one country, and then stranded gas everywhere. So it's pretty much the same. So building local solution, I think, is the key. And for that, you need the collaborations.
Yeah, and now moving from the resources, we can move on to technologies. We've seen a lot of developments. We've seen, so putting oil and gas on the table means using more or less the same technologies, maybe with some advancements. But other resources, other sources of energy have come up, and how can these new technologies have helped? Maybe in the case of Indonesia, like using these resources have helped the sustainable energies targets. What were those technologies that you've used, or the technology advancements that you've been implementing? And if you have any other experience beyond Indonesia, we'll be happy to hear.
Yeah. I think what I notice is the most constraint is not actually the technology, because the technology, it is correct that eventually we will require more advanced technology to become net zero, but at least to reach a certain point whereby we can reduce the emission and grow at the same time, the technology is pretty much there already, right? So it is building the economic of scale. And for that, it's going to require a certain regulation that can foster projects to take off. I think that is most constraining at the moment, actually, right? So, for example, in Indonesia, we have plenty resources of biofuel, right? So to reduce the import requirements of gas oil, then we develop biodiesel. And now at the moment, we are also thinking about developing bioethanol, because for now we are also a big importer of sugar. So we need to develop technology that is a second generation without competing with food. So we can increase our bioethanol production without decreasing the supply for sugar. Those kind of technology is actually there already. It is just finding the right policy and also regulation to unlock those technology.
we're always back to policy. If you
Yeah.
don't have the right policy framework in place, I mean, there are many solutions out there, many companies that would be willing to invest,
That is correct.
but you need to attract
That is
those
correct.
players
That is
into the
correct.
country. And Elizabeth, I mean, you mentioned, green hydrogen is not necessarily a technology; it's probably a source of energy rather. But a lot of advancements has been made in that space. So tell us more about this technology, or what Namibia has done with green hydrogen or any other new technology solution.
Yeah. I like to quote my minister, and he likes saying Namibia is more like a mixed basket. We're not only focusing on one source of energy, but we're also focusing on green hydrogen. And the reason why we are focusing on is really to cure energy poverty, but also to make sure that we have jobs for Namibians in our country. So when you look at green hydrogen, we have done well with the Hyphen project. I mean, the Hyphen project, government is going to take 24% stake in that 10 billion USD project currently in the country, and which would like to produce 350,000 tons of green ammonia, which would obviously be used locally, but our local market cannot take up all that 350,000 tons. So that would also be exported to Europe, and that would be happening in the Southern Valley. But we're using this technology, like, I mean, in the past, the discussion was around gas, it was around, oil, it was around that. But now we are trying to diversify and make sure that households in Namibia do have access to electricity. So we're using this green hydrogen in so many different ways, not just exporting green ammonia for various synthetic fuels, but we're also using it to make sure that we power, the most vulnerable communities in Namibia.
Yeah, and I think so. Mr. Santoso mentioned how important is in general to have cooperation across the countries. Sometimes it's very difficult to find the right balance within our countries, but helping or looking for help outside across the region can maybe give an extra support. So, Mr. Tabang, what's from a South African perspective, what would be, how can regional cooperation help achieving certain targets in the energy space? If you want to bring some examples from your own experience, or maybe some suggestion on how regional cooperation can work.
Yeah, there's an opportunity to split the value creation, energy value creation, and have different countries within a region focusing on one or two parts of the value chain, right? So let me use the energy transitions as an example. So there are specific minerals which are required for the solar panels, as an example. And those minerals, most of them are found on the continent, on the African continent. So if country A has an expertise to efficiently extract that specific mineral from the ground, so that country A will be the expert country to do that activity. Yeah. We have country B, country C, which has financial resources. We have country D, which has processing expertise. So the idea here would be not to execute the entire value creation within one country, but rather to diversify across various countries on the region. And that's how you then, over medium, long term, you now want to do a skills exchange so that, in a long term, the entire region creates expertise on processing critical minerals for energy transitions. The other collaboration at regional level, I mean, if you look at SADC as an example, right, the Southern African Development Communities, South Africa economically is bigger, right? And as a result, its energy consumption is higher, right? So you could have hydrogen projects being initiated and to some extent developed in Namibia, and South Africa of taking some of that for its own energy processing, and vice versa. South Africa could be putting panels in the Northern Cape, solar PV panels in the Northern Cape, and exporting some of that electrical energy to Namibia. So it's not only on one area, the point I'm trying to make is not only on one area, but it could be across different parts of energy, including energy transitions and energy trading.
Yeah,
Yep.
leveraging the strengths of each member of or of each country to make sure that the whole value chain is covered and you get the most out of this cooperation, right?
Yes, the value chain within the region is covered, yeah.
Yeah, and Elizabeth, on green hydrogen and regional cooperation, you've been mentioned and quoted, so.
Yeah, so Namibia, we recognize that we cannot, industrialize in isolation. Of course, we need some sort of regional integration to make sure that it's possible. And I think one of the examples that I would like to give is looking at Botswana. Botswana is landlocked, and they don't have access to a port. So like what he mentioned just earlier, that it's very important to recognize your strength. And for us, that's where a lot of, where we can receive a lot of goods through our ports and make sure that Botswana also has access to that. So regional integration is really looking at your strength, what it is that you have, what else other countries have, and making sure that across the value chain, each country is really able to benefit. But I think from a resource perspective, from a policy perspective, we have seen some good regional collaboration taking place. If you look at the policies that EU has in place, they are benefiting those EU countries. So if we could also come together as SADC or really as an African region and really take this energy issues very serious and implement policies and incentives where we can, throughout the African continent, my goodness, I think we can achieve most of what we would like to achieve.
Absolutely. And Mr. Santoso, your fellow speakers have been talking about what should happen in Africa for this regional cooperation to work. So what has happened in Indonesia? For how did regional cooperation work there? You were saying that it does happen, so.
Yeah. So I think it's pretty much the same case in Indonesia. As actually, we are part of the Southeast Asian countries. We also have a diverse economic conditions of the countries. Right. For example, when we want to develop a green projects, we need to utilize adjacent markets such as Singapore or Korea or Japan, because even though the domestic market may not be ready for, say, green hydrogen or clean fuels, etc. But however, we need to start the project. So I think it's important to build the scale of economics by enabling those projects to be exported to the country that can absorb the products, while at the same time we are starting the projects, make it bankable, and then make it more economical scale, bigger economical scale, and then hopefully that can also cater domestic market as well. So that kind of approach is actually what is trying to be implemented in Indonesia as well.
And there is a thought that you shared before the panel. You were talking about this local champion. Maybe we're talking more about a company, but maybe also a country can be a champion, right, for the others, just like Namibia or other countries in Northern African have done. But so moving from partnership or cooperation between countries to partnership among different types of stakeholders, everybody talks about public-private partnership. So can I have a thought from all the panelists here on does it work? Is it worth pursuing? How should it be implemented? And or if it has been implemented already in your country, so how did it work? Do you want to start? Yes, please.
If I may go first. It does work, but at design stage, so at the program design stage, we need to carefully think about how to implement it, right? We need to allocate, develop a risk allocation matrix so that we understand the role that private sector is expected to play and the risks that they will assume, right? And the risk that the role that government will play and the risk that government will assume. So if you carefully think about right at the beginning, right, you don't go to the market without having defined those roles, responsibilities, and risks upfront. Right, number one. Number two, the regulatory regime, right, in a country where a triple P is being considered, it needs to be market friendly. Because think about it this way, most of the time government will go with triple P route because of either the funds or the skills, right? And if private sector is expected to use their investors' funding for infrastructure project, they need some sort of assurance that they will be able to at least make the return on investment that their shareholders have given them the mandate to go after. So the regulations in that particular country is very important that it's market friendly, because without that you are not able to attract I'll call it the cream of the triple P players, especially in the private sectors. So in South Africa's case, we've since 2011, we've implemented in wind and solar especially, what we call an IPP model. It's a similar type as triple P. It worked to a certain point, and at some, I think 2018, we nearly collapsed the entire system. Changes in political leadership. Secondly, the commitments that were made by the private players at that time, they were not being delivered, right? So, for example, local community development. If you don't monitor that part of the project, right, you find that amongst the local communities, there is no benefit. And one or two individuals are benefiting, but the broader community is not. So you need to monitor those commitments and obligations that private sector makes at the beginning of the program. So overall, it does work, but you need to design it properly, you need to have the right regulations, and you need to monitor each other's obligations to make sure that the entire community at large is happy.
Yeah, so I think I pretty much agree with Mr. Tabang mentioned. I think that's the most fundamental key in making sure that PPP will be successful. Because pretty much we understand what the private sector can take, what kind of risk private sector can and cannot take. So for the risk the private sector cannot take, and the market has not been fully developed to understand and comprehend that risk, then the government needs to be wise and step in. So those kind of government intervention, I think what is very critical in ensuring that the PPP will work.
Yeah, it's not easy, and there are different ways so you can do that. Elizabeth, do you want to add a thought from Namibia's experience?
Yes, so in Namibia we have a Triple P Act that governs triple Ps with the government of the Republic of Namibia, and those have been very challenging. I mean, there's an entire procurement process that need to be undergone for government to enter into partnership with private companies, and many a times the process can really be longer than what is expected. So I think in terms of policies, we need to come up with new interventions that would allow for these relationships to go much smoother. But of course, we have taken on, or we're about to, there's a potential in terms of hyphen with taking up the 24% stake that I've mentioned earlier. But I've seen the benefits that come with also this triple P projects is that there's a lot of processes that private sector is not held back for, as opposed to them running the project alone, especially when government has taken that certain procedures and certain processes would then not become applicable because government have that specific stake. So there is an advantage to that. that, and there's also a disadvantage. And like I said, it's very important for the risks to be very clear, to outline from the beginning, so that government exactly knows what they're going into. But I also think that I think in terms of triple Ps, those can also be challenging for government, because in most instances they are very hesitant in terms of the risk that has.
Yeah, of course, and the mindset of a public stakeholder and a private stakeholder can be very different. So putting these two profiles together requires a lot of clarity. I mean, from the very beginning we said how important policy clarity is to attract investment, but to make sure that everyone knows what the rule of the game are, yes. And be able to feel comfortable investing in a country. Now, before moving to the sickest question that I have, and I will ask Mr. Santoso later, is there any question from the audience? Otherwise, I will move on to the sickest question of the panel. Well, it's my turn then. Funding. Oh, okay. That's the big word that nobody wants to hear. Everybody, I mean, it's the elephant in the room, right? I mean, funding is difficult in some countries, is difficult in certain part of the energy sectors. Some investments is easier than others. You have this perspective of an oil and gas company. For you, maybe certain investments are easier than others. Yeah. So why and what could change? What could be a good model to attract more investment and more funding to other
to be honest, I don't have solutions for that. Yeah, but at least this is from our perspective. Like, as in Pertamina, most of our overseas investment are on the oil and gas sector, which the risk type is very much different with that of building an infrastructure in a certain country, right? Where you are more exposed to the local risk of that particular country. While in oil and gas investment, of course, you are also building infrastructure, but you will always have an international oil company taking up all the political risks, right? Which may not be the case in infrastructure investments, right? So I think the role of multilateral is key. Multilaterals, probably, I don't know, probably like blended funds or something like that. They need to take those political risks and spur more international investment into the country, because what Africa is required is not just investment on the upstream, but all the way in entire value chain of it, down into the downstream, where you can add values, right? Because what you want is energy not to be sold, but energy you use to spur economic growth and build industry in Africa, because that's the only way if you want to sustain a growth that is meaningful for the region.
Thank you. So before we wrap up, can I ask maybe a final thought from, given the discussion we've had on the subject?
Yeah, maybe just a short. You okay? Sorry. Maybe just a short comment from my side, and I want to pick on what my colleague here, Wisni, was saying. You know, funding is one topic that recently is being used to direct energy transitions of many African countries, right? You find that it's very difficult to finance a gas infrastructure project, as an example, because the discussions are more towards green energy, and gas is not seen as green enough. So there's an initiative spearheaded by APO with a specific bank, Africa Energy Bank, that is currently being created to primarily focus on developing energy infrastructure for the continent. My thinking is that such initiatives are important if Africa is to develop the infrastructure that it needs for its communities, not the infrastructure that is being directed to develop for the benefit of others. So we need to also, when we look at funding, sit around the table, not one African country, not two, but a group of African countries, sit around the table and have honest and detailed discussions on how best we can utilize our varying resources to raise capital for infrastructure projects on Africa.
Thank you. Mr. Santoso, before I lose completely my voice today.
I also experienced the same. So I think Africa has immense potential. I'm very sure, and both Indonesia and Africa has many things to learn from each other, because pretty much in Indonesia we also face the same challenges, which is to grow and also transition at the same time. Those are very big challenges, but I think we can learn from each other. Because Indonesia, like Africa, may have experiences on certain sector that may be implementable in certain part of Africa. So happy to be here and share the experiences from my country. Thank
Absolutely.
you.
Elizabeth.
Yes, I think in closing what I wanted to say, and I think it's a conversation that I'm picking up, Sylvia and Wisnu, the one that we have been having outside, is that there's a lot of interest in sustainable energies. There's a lot of funding that is coming out, but there are no off-takers. I think the moment you come and you want to start signing off-take agreements to make sure that your project becomes bankable, that has proven to be a challenge. So I think my takeaway or my keywords is we really need to deal with the policy issue. That's one. But two, I think also the off-takers really need to start being serious so that we can get this industry moving and taking off ground. So those are my 2 points, or my 2 wishes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. And please join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panelists. Really do appreciate it. Very insightful, very engaging. And I think you guys are right. The synergies in SADC is impeccable, Elizabeth. Some of those policies do need to align with what the different countries are doing. And hopefully we'll see a lot more of the cross-border trade that you guys are hoping for. Can we give them another round of applause?